my colleague Francesco, my co-speaker today, and welcome to all of you. So I let you work out the years, but in 1993, I was in Vicino, Trento. I was on Il Fiume Noce at Mezzana for a canoeing world championship. So I have many fond memories of this region and this area, and I wish I could be there in person, but hopefully that will happen in the future. Look, well done on the new course. I'll give you some insights into what NBS and urban health is doing and what it's doing in our project. So I'm just going to share a screen, and I have to confess something first. Not only am I a visitor to the region you're in, but I guess I also studied Italian in university. I studied it badly. I managed to fail Italian in university, so mi dispiace. The third piece is I'm not qualified in NBS, right? I'm just going to start with that, right? So I'm not an expert, but I'm experienced because of a number of years working on this project and related projects. So just hold that thought. Expertise is hard to find in this area, but experience is something else. And I think we're at the cusp of something new whereby we can instill competencies and create a learning ecosystem. It's something I'm going to talk about today, to support people to learn about MBS, to become experts and not just experienced. Like, I'm experienced, others are experienced, but I think that this is an area in which there are very few experts. So let's go into this. So some problems we all know about, okay? I'm not going to list them, but let's just suffice to say there's climate change problem, there's a biodiversity crisis, we have air pollution, which according to some estimates accounts for almost 800,000 deaths annually in Europe. Now, just think about that. That's 800,000. So maybe that's a city you live in. Maybe that's several cities combined, but that's a large number of people who, according to estimates, die from air pollution annually in Europe. We have a physical inactivity issue, often termed sedentary behavior. So we have some health issues around this, and we have something called green poverty, which I'll be able to explain to you. So one way to look at these issues is say that are they all wicked problems? Like, are they hard to define? Are they what we call fuzzy problems? That means the boundaries around them are unclear. In fact, one of the issues about wicked problems is you're not quite sure when you've solved them. And there's definitely potential adverse effects of solutions. So even with NBS, you put in green infrastructure into a city, for example, in Barcelona, you can get canyon effects. So if you put in green infrastructure around a roadway, you can actually trap air pollution. And this is why I say I'm not an expert. So here's a psychologist, that's my training, talking about air pollution, but I have published in the area. So we'll just say I have some experience. But one only understands a wicked problem by solving it or attempting to solve it. And like nature-based solutions, by definition, about deriving solutions to a number of problems and looking to generate benefits, co-benefits, that's the language we're used to. But we'll look at another phrase today, what are called additional benefits. So these problems are not entirely related. Now, the reason I'm a psychologist and talking here today is because I've worked as a psychologist in different areas. And one of the things I realized that actually environmental factors were really key in sport, in communities, at urban level. So this is, to understand that these problems are not entirely unrelated, but also actually some of the solutions might actually be aligned. So the way to look at this, let's just take the climate change issue, right? So there are benefits from mitigating climate change, for example, through green infrastructure, because it has multiple benefits, or through nature-based solutions. And what we do is we switch from this emissions debate, what's the level of CO2 from X industry or Y industry, to something about emotions. Because you ask somebody about, do you want more trees in your neighborhood? And there's actually a 2016 NBS survey from Eurobarometer, from the European Commission, which shows that this is actually a good idea. So people generally across most European countries, it was EU 28 at the time, they all said they wanted green infrastructure. So nature is perceived in a very positive way, and this can mitigate many of the issues around climate change. And we know that climate has a negative impact upon nature. So this complexity has to be captured. We're suggesting that you incorporate the health issues into the climate debate, measure health benefits precisely. And by that, I don't mean by like a randomized controlled trial, something we all learned about during COVID times, but actually more naturalistic methods. So we want to refine metrics to assess human health benefits and promote transdisciplinary study to use an appropriate lens. And this is based on a model from the Royal Society in the UK. Now, where does this take us? This takes us to our project. So it's one of 4 projects started in 2020. We got about 10 million euros each to study urban health, typically using nature-based solutions combined with digital and social innovation. We actually have something really interesting. We have 2 advisory boards. We've one for innovation because we're an innovation project, but we've one for research because we want to have research, and we've been lucky enough already to be published in the journal Lancet, Planetary Health, Environmental Psychology, and many, many others. So we estimate we'll have about 60 outputs by the end of our project. And interestingly, some of those are just protocol papers. So if you know anything about open science frameworks, there's a pathway by which we publish what we're going to do in advance, then do it, and then publish the findings. And by publishing what we're going to do, our protocol, that adds to our open science approach. So we're more transparent, we share data and follow what we call the FAIR procedures around open science and data access. Davide Gianelletti, whom you're familiar with, he is one of the experts in NBS, I'm glad to say. So he's a member of our advisory board, along with other esteemed professors like Matilda van den Bosch, formerly of University of British Columbia, and Nikki Franziskaki. So you might be familiar with these names. In our project, we work with 6 cities, fundamentally. We also work with some other cities, but we target our work in around 6 cities, and each of them would have got close to €500,000 to develop nature-based solutions in their city. Specifically, that amount of money is dedicated just for the green infrastructure, not just staff. But we include green capitals, Lahti and Tallinn, also Versailles in France, Limerick in Ireland, Burgas, Bulgaria, and Umeå. The total population across all these cities is in excess of 1 million. And that's really interesting. So if we do something really well in our project, even if it's not huge scale, we're able to look at the impact across 1 million people across 6 cities. And then we can extrapolate to some degree, or estimate, how, if you upscaled and replicated this across the 1,000 or so cities in Europe, what impact this would have. And that's one of the elements of our project. So our tagline is, nature-based solutions are a natural way to foster urban mental health and well-being. So we've this focus on psychology. I'm a psychologist, we've many others in it, and well-being. And this takes us away from the typical health measures. So health is often measured in reduced morbidity, and that's something we want to achieve, but not something we're so focused on, because we're actually more concerned with connecting people to the nature that we're going to cultivate and foster in their cities, and promote psychological well-being, which is about people having healthier and better lives, not simply less air pollution, but actually feeling a connection socially, and being more psychologically resilient. So here's the timeline of our project. We begun in September 2020. In 2021, we had COVID scenarios, so we were delayed and weren't able to work in the cities. We did a pilot intervention. I'll put a link up to that at the end, where we did these interventions, small scale interventions in cities, in the 6 target cities, just to see the response of the citizens, what are their views, their beliefs. And this ensures that our full NBS implementation will meet the needs of the community, or will more likely achieve what they want. We are actually just conducting baseline monitoring. So I'm back from being, flat out in 4 cities where we measure multiple time points each day across a small area. Sometimes we're walking 24 kilometers a day, so it's not really that small. And we're actually walking to different time points in an area where the NBS will be in, and in a contrast area. And we're measuring many different factors, which we'll come to in a few minutes. So this year we have, in autumn, there's the implementation, so the NBS, specifically the green infrastructure and other elements will be implemented. And then we follow up this time next year, and we follow this up with a health impacts assessment. Now, what's unique about our project is this concept of health, right? Where, like many of the most recent projects, which use planetary health and One Health, we call multidimensional health perspective. So this is 360 intergenerational health. What's really interesting, we consider sleep to be a health variable, right? Why is that? Because if you're in a city and you've got high levels of noise pollution, sleep is disrupted typically, and that has a long-term impact upon stress. So we're concerned with measuring sleep. We're concerned with how often people go to nature, because there's evidence that going to nature for 120 minutes per week is a health determinant. We're also concerned with people's appreciation and knowledge of nature and their connection to it, which I'll come to in a moment. We're concerned with physical activity, how people move in a city, whether they use active travel, what are the sustainable urban mobility solutions that cities have. We're concerned with nutrition. Do people, seek out food which is high nutritional value and low in carbon footprint, or is there a high density of fast food outlets in the area, for example? So what this allows us to do is use a wealth of new measures and innovate in measurement. And that's something we think will be a legacy of our project. So here's one of the other innovations. You may not even have heard of this term, but you may have felt it. So when you're in nature, we have an appreciation or a connection to it. We can use the term relation. We can use the term attachment from a psychological perspective. But fundamentally, we have, as researchers in NBS, overlooked this connection to nature. So nature connectedness encompasses our individual differences in what we think, feel, and experience when we go to nature, or when we think about it, because we don't even have to be in nature to actually have this connection. Recent findings from work by some of our colleagues who are in our advisory board, like David Sheffield and others, it shows that it's both measurable and learnable. So learnable is really interesting. That suggests it's not a trait. It's not something you're simply born with. It might be trait-like. It might, change depending on your developmental trajectory. Nature exposure growing up in the countryside as a child might predispose you to having a stronger connection to nature later. What's really interesting is that it's linked to two things. One is psychological well-being. So higher levels of nature connectedness, basically allow people to cope better with life. Second thing is, and this is really interesting in light of climate change, is that it's actually linked to more sustainable behaviors. So just think about it like this. If you're able to increase nature connectedness amongst citizens, you're actually able to make them engage in environmental conservation, pro-environmental behavior, and citizen science activities, for example. So you're able to push them along this sustainability and environmental conservation continuum. And this is a really interesting insight we've got from recent research. Now, if we just go to some of the possible solutions that we have in our project. So I want you to pause for a moment to just think, we normally talk about NBS, benefits for the environment, for ecosystem, for air quality, for biodiversity, co-benefits for health. Well, we flip it because our priority in this study is to think about human health. So we focus on the benefit for health, the co-benefits for the environment, and these additional benefits for sustainability and pro-environmental behavior, because we know if we connect people to nature, we're going to have these potential additional benefits. And it's not to deny, the role of biodiversity as we have in the IUCN and EU definitions around NBS. It's just we are funded under a call which specifically mandated us to look at health. So we put that first. Here's something interesting we found, right? So just as one of the key findings from our work, published in Lancet Planetary Health is that the WHO have a recommendation from 2016 and an urban health working group that within 5 minutes of your home should be able to access essentially half a football pitch size of green space. If you do that, they thought that that would be a good health determinant. It's actually, part of the UN SDG, target 11.7 under sustainable cities and communities to provide universal access and inclusive and accessible green and public spaces. So it's even within the SDG framework. What we found out in 2021 was you would save 50,000 lives in Europe alone if you ensured that all citizens had access to this green space requirement. Now, we found out that 62% of Europeans approximately didn't have this access. So, we think we're in a green city or a green urban Europe, we're not. And that's something which can be easily rectified as part of, the forthcoming nature restoration laws, part of the Biodiversity 2030 strategy and 100 carbon climate neutral and smart city initiatives. So this is something we can work on. This leads us to the idea that there actually is green poverty across Europe. And it may not be in your city, but it's in many of the 1,000 studies that were part of Barbosa et al.'s study. The second solution, and I won't take too much longer, actually suggests that you don't have to be in nature to gain benefits. You can get digital nature. So digital nature is looking at imagery, looking at your phone. You may scroll through Instagram. Many of you might have a phone background which encompasses nature, which says something about your own personal identity. But actual virtual reality nature or immersive virtual nature, we've shown to be, very lead to high levels of engagement with specific tasks. Not to be a replacement, but to be another way to augment our nature experiences. So in a model with Sigbjørn Little of Norway, one of my colleagues, we propose that actually going to what we call authentic or non-digital nature has the best effects, but some risks. You could go to a green space with high levels of air pollution, for example. But virtual nature has some benefits and perhaps low risks. One of the risks we're investigating has to do with cyber sickness. So that is that you don't have a high fidelity virtual environment, you have some challenges. So this is important to know that there are people who work in healthcare, work in airports, in elderly care, in health facilities, who can't access nature readily. And that this is a supplement that we can use to connect people to nature to change their behavior and their relationship with nature. I'll just go to solution 3, and this is interesting as, normally as a scientist, we're concerned with big data, and we do have some big data approaches. In fact, from University of Torino, we have social sense of analysis from Twitter. But the other side of it, in our research, we're actually really concerned with what are the individual differences. That's what we mean by idiographic approach. So we want to know, what do experts think? What do people in communities that have expertise, people that work in mental health in communities, people that work in the parks department, decision makers, cities, what are their views and what are their kind of memories? So our focus is shift the focus on the person, not simply on the environment. And I'll give you an example of this. We actually have an intervention with decision makers, including deputy mayors of cities, whereby they go on a walking tour of the city with us and they become citizen scientists and measure the quality of the environment using some of the tools you see shortly. And that's designed as an awareness raising tool for them, and also to prompt conversations about climate change, about health, and about the interactions between nature and human and environmental health. So if nature counts, what do you assess? So this is the question we came to in our project this year. Well, we could assess the data we can get, from Copernicus satellite data, and for sure we do rely on that. If you understand how that works, it takes quite a long time for that, information, normally about 5 years to get the depth of information you want from satellite imagery. So you could look at fixed monitoring from municipalities who have a number of fixed monitoring sites. You could use modeling, but actually we're more concerned, in addition to doing that, we want to hear what the voice of citizens is. So marginalized groups, we develop methods to amplify the voice of marginalized groups. We use person-centered monitoring. So when we're testing or monitoring the cities, we're actually using not just standard air quality measures, we're using person-centered and wearable devices to measure environmental quality. We use tools which have a legacy beyond the project. So people in the municipality, people in communities, local community and action groups can use these same apps and tools because they're not very expensive to use. We capture positive factors of the environment. So what we normally know about the qualities of a city, you might, if you're lucky, find out what the proportion of green space, tree canopy cover is. But typically, the two most commonly reported environmental indices for a city are the co-hazards of air and noise pollution. They don't tell you about where there is good air quality. They don't tell you about natural soundscape, where you're going to hear a lot of different bird song, where you're going to actually have high levels of biodiversity. So this positive approach is quite different. So we use these methods and we use this to augment publicly available quantitative data. So I'm going to give you some insights into the tools we use. So here's an image of us working on the urban greenway. That's Evelise and two of the team from Umeå commune in Sweden. I have to say, it did snow while we were working that day. And as an Irish person, we're not that accustomed to snow. So it was curiously cold. That's all I can say. If you're working outdoors for 6 to 8 hours a day and it's snowing, it's a little challenging, but it wasn't snowing that day. On the left, you can see an image of a natural outdoor living room in Limerick, and one of the team from Limerick walking on the log in the green playground. So we're not just building or supporting the development of greenways, which are these routes, giving away the title of the project, GoGreenRoutes, but actually having areas for rest, recreation, and social activities and inclusion along the way. So whether they're parklets or whether they're natural living rooms or playgrounds, these are the way in which we work in our project. So here are some of the tools we use, and this is really important, and I can put some of these into the chat afterwards. We use person-centered monitoring, often using apps as well as other measures I mentioned. So you can see we use two different apps for looking at birdsong. The second one here actually is the one we use most commonly, and that's called the Warbler app. And it gives you a guess of what the sounds you hear. And honestly, when you've walked around these cities for 4 days, you pretty much have either seen the bird or heard it. It was very funny. We're in one of the cities and it came up and said woodpecker, and we're like, woodpecker? It's quite common, but it's very cold and we're not quite in the forest. This is in Sweden. And then, of course, we actually heard the woodpecker ourselves. So, actually having your ears open and not just looking at the data is quite important. The one in the middle is actually air quality. And what you're seeing there is PM10. So that's particular matter of 10 microns in size, smaller than a grain of sand, quite problematic in terms of health, but not as bad as PM1 or 2.5, which pass the blood-brain barrier, so if major health issues. And this is a suburban area you're looking at beside a Volvo factory in the city of Umeå in Sweden. And it's just to highlight, actually, even in an area which we thought was green, has quite a bit of tree canopy cover, but because of the high level of traffic movement and congestion with non-EV vehicles, there's still high levels of air pollution. There's also grit on the ground. So this is the end of winter, and there's still grit on the ground from for making the roads usable, and this increases the PM10. So even somewhere you perceive as green actually does have high levels of air pollution. And then you can see this is Leaf Snap app. So we use this actually to look at some species which we're not sure about, because generally we make some survey of the species using a tool called Recital from IS Global. And that's a really good tool, but sometimes we supplement the qualitative and quantitative assessment with these apps, sometimes for our own curiosity. Is that a native species? Is that non-native? And finally, on the right, you're going to see this is from a really interesting app called Hush City app. And it gives us decibel measures, but it's really cool because it links you to a map. And actually, most of our data from these apps are already online. For example, from Hush City app, our data across 4 of the 6 cities we work on is already online, and you can also hear the sound recording and see an image from where we took it at multiple time points each day. Really interesting point is when we were in Tallinn last week, there's a curious story. We arrived and landed in the airport and there was smoke because there was a huge fire next to the airport. And honestly, we weren't that far away from Russia, so that was a little bit scary, but it turned out to be just a waste treatment center having a fire. But the background noise from traffic was really high the whole time because, you know, you forget that if you have a motorway or an interstate or an autostrada, you do have high levels of background noise. So, you know, when you're there for a couple of days, your perception is that you're hearing nature a lot, but actually when you listen back to the audio and you look at the decibel levels, it's actually predominantly dominated by the noise of traffic. So this is the last tool I'd like to show you. This is our walking interview, and it's a method we devised and said, okay, we want to have a citizen-centered approach. So it's a quote by Albert Camus, who said, don't walk in front of me, I may not follow. Don't walk behind me, I may not lead. Walk beside me and be my friend. And with this method, we walk beside people. We ask, can we record the interview? They have to be adult age, so we confirm their age. We record, audio record it, and then digitally transcribe it afterwards, unless it's in some of the languages which we have difficulty with. And we work across 6 cities with 9 different languages, so it is quite a challenge. But we ask fairly simple questions. We ask, like, why did people come there? We ask about, you know, what we call the 300-meter rule. Do they live within 5 minutes of the area? And we also elaborate a little bit on these questions. So the questions aren't strictly asked, or asked in a more naturalistic way. We ask how often they go to green space and how long, to try and make an estimate if they've reached the 120 minutes per week threshold. And then we ask about what they notice in the area. And, you know, if there is bird song, if there are wildlife, if there's a tree canopy cover, we focus on that and see what their answers are. One of the interesting things around perception of safety, because safety in one city is about, you know, risk of theft or attack or antisocial behavior. And safety in another city is actually about road traffic or vehicular traffic, about the risk from cars. Very interesting when you ask about more green spaces in the city, the answer is largely in the affirmative. And sometimes at the end of the interview, we stop recording and they tell us so much more, but that's okay. One interesting point is the 3 words that describe people's experience of green space in the city. Those words often give us a rich tapestry of knowledge, which we could never get otherwise. So just to finish on 1 or 2 ideas about a learning ecosystem. So I'm an environmental psychologist now.
Sorry, Tadgh. Yeah. I don't want to interrupt you, but it's been 21 minutes more or less.
Yeah, I'll just be 2 minutes, no problem.
Okay, so, thanks.
So I'm an environmental psychologist, and what does that mean to you? Well, what it means is that you don't all have to be environmental psychologists. In fact, if we do that, then we've no experts in the room. But you may need to know a little bit about environmental psychology, or you may need to find an environmental psychologist to try and answer some of the questions that are really important for NBS. So I'm just going to go forward to one final idea, and this is the NBS ecosystem. So we are not working as an island. We work with the Natura Network, Network Nature, Biodiversity, 100 Climate Neutral Cities Network, allied projects where I met Davide, Gianelletti on Renature, Connecting Nature, and we have summer and autumn schools. But just my take-home message is every day is a school day in NBS, so keep learning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tadgh. It's been very interesting to see your point of view. As an engineer, I didn't know about the environmental psychology, to be honest. So thanks for introducing us to this very broad topic and discipline. And I would ask for people who have some questions to wait for the end of also the next speaker talk, in order to have a wider Q&A slot. So thanks again, Tadgh.
That's it, Livy. That's it.
Okay. Now I'm introducing to you the next speaker, who is Francesco Ricciardi, who is an environmental scientist working on the Asian Development Bank. He has a very long list of publications and experiences, so I'm recommend you to look for him. And today he's going to present us some, let's say, risky situation in terms of greenwashing, because we know that nature-based solutions are very interesting and, let's say, also useful, but on the other hand, we have to carefully think about the, let's say, side aspects that we can face with. So I don't want to steal you much more time. So Francesco, the floor is yours, and thanks. Sorry, we are looking at your speaker display. Okay, thanks. I think your mic is turned off.
Let's see, now it works.
Yeah. Now it works. Thanks.
I'm sorry. Okay, let's do it again. Okay, so is it in the right slide or not?
Sorry, Francesco, again the display is
yeah, okay, sorry, no, we are doing this since the COVID and still
yeah, I know. Sorry,
I don't know what
to hear.
no, it's okay.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much again, Livia, and thank you everyone to be here, and it's a pleasure to have the chance to speak to an Italian audience first. Probably finally someone will not complain about my accent, at least. So I'm going to talk about today about, yes, as Livia said, nature-based solution and some of the issue that we can encounter when we talk about the development of this technology. Let me start very quickly about who I am. Livia introduced me. I work for the Asian Development Bank. I believe that not many of you are familiar with the international financial development. So the Asian Development Bank is a bank of financing developing countries in mostly infrastructure, in policy development, infrastructural roads, energy plants, health, many others. It's similar to what the World Bank does, for example, or the European Investment Bank. But we are just focusing on Asia. And yeah, I work here in Italy at the moment, but normally I work from Manila in the Philippines. And I was listening what Tadgh was saying about the green spaces and the importance of having nature. But few minutes walk from home, and they really resonate with me. If you any of you got the chance to visit one of these huge mega cities in Asia, like Manila, Jakarta, or some of the Chinese towns, cities, probably has realized how massive these cities are and how little nature has been introduced in this development. Cement is everywhere. But then if you enter in a government palace or in a private house, you see, I don't know, bucolic pictures or, you know, so as a witness of this need, of the human need of being close to nature. So let's start so a couple of very basic concepts. So you probably know we are dealing with terrible environmental challenges. Climate change is one of them, but it's not the only one. We have biodiversity crisis, so with millions of species that are at the moment in danger of extinction. And biodiversity is really the safety net of our civilization. So if something happens, is the biodiversity that allow us to respond and to be resilient to environmental stress. Of course, there are debates. Climate change, as you probably know, is very polarized and very politicized. Biodiversity probably less, but what is sure is that without nature, we cannot survive. The debates here is the urgency of the strategies that we need to apply to address these challenges. So what are nature-based solutions? Mostly are, like the word say, is our approach to environmental management, to cities, to transport, to all the development projects or the building project that you have that use natural process and system to address these environmental challenges. Example are green infrastructure, ecosystem-based adaptation, agroecology, for example. I'm going to focus today on a couple of them. Nature-based solution for climate mitigation. Climate mitigation, probably you know, is all the activities that are reducing or aim to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Of course, nature is one of our first allies. You know, we can talk all day about technology of carbon capture and sequestration, but without restoring and without protecting nature, all this technology is not able to save us. So this solution for climate mitigation, for example, planting trees and restoring wetlands, or restoring ecosystems in blue ecosystem, for example. There is a lot of talk about blue carbon in these days. So restoration of mangrove forests, for example, that store huge amount of carbon. And then the second solution is about biodiversity conservation. As I told you before, I'm going to focus on these two topics, biodiversity conservation and climate mitigation. There are different types of nature-based solutions for biodiversity conservation, more or less equally distributed between restoration of ecosystems, integrated landscape management, sustainable agriculture, and creation of protected areas. These solutions have been proven to have remarkable results, but they have a problem. They don't make money. If you go in probably on the street and you talk about development, what's development? You can talk with a person on the street and someone will tell you that, oh, development is building a road to facilitate trades. Someone else is going to tell you, oh, development is to have a school in our village or a hospital accessible to everyone. And that's right, that's true. But this also bring money to the people that build this infrastructure, especially roads or big power plants, for example. If you want to protect natural areas, unfortunately, the money involved in that is far less. So the willingness, especially for the private sector, to participate in the protection of biodiversity or restoration of ecosystem is not so much. You may understand why. When you decide, for example, that there is a specific coast areas that you can choose to dredge the sand out of it and build something or restore the mangroves. The GDP, which is the measure that everyone use, the index that everyone use to measure the wealth, is going to tell you that if you take down a forest and use the logs to build something, as a positive influence on the GDP. On the contrary, if you leave the forest or the mangroves like where they are, you don't have any influence on the GDP, except of course with some maybe tourist kind of income, but it's very difficult to monetize. And you know that politicians, economists are very focused on that specific value. There's the value that you assign to a transaction. So how we can mitigate the risk of impact of this climate-related hazards. Nature-based solutions, again, are very important. They can help to mitigate floods, landslides, droughts. In Italy, we have in the very recent days a clear example of how probably the not optimal use of the planning of the landscape can create huge problems for local residents. But using natural processes and nature-based solution, community can be shielded from this devastating effect of climate occurrences. They are going to happen more and more often in the future. This is an example of NBS for climate resilience. You can find this in a very recent publication made by the World Bank that I shared with Livia earlier today. And you can see that there are a lot of different interventions you can choose between forest, protection of river and floodplains, urban green, and many other. I won't focus on any of them today. Maybe I'll give you a couple of examples later. But all of these measures that are potential use, they have a double advantage. The advantage of mitigation, climate mitigation, and the advantage of biodiversity conservation. So what do we need to make the NBS works? I was listening a few days back to a presentation of someone which wanted to build a road exactly in the middle of a huge forest. And he was claiming that that road was nature-based, was a nature-based road. And I was thinking about what is a nature-based road? So are you using, I don't know, wooden pavement or something like this? No, sometimes the claim of having nature-based solution are not really, how would I say, true, you know? And this is a problem because the funding that are used for nature-based solution are not unlimited. There is still a bias toward normal engineering solutions. I will talk about later, for example, seawalls. So if we start moving money and financial instruments to solutions which are not true nature-based solution, then is a damage for those projects that actually need more money to be implemented and to have all these multiple advantages that nature-based solution bring to you. So how we recognize if a nature-based solution is a true one or is a kind of, I would say, maybe not greenwash, but an incomplete nature-based solution. So do we need different partners to participate in developing and planning an NBS? Engineers, most of you, I believe, engineers are the ones that are responsible to actually design and plan on how actually to build this structure. But also you need people on the financial side. Not always nature-based solutions are called bankable. So as I was telling you before, there is always a risk that developing project, NBS project, are not achieving the same return of investment, or ERR as it's called, economic return, rate of return of a typical project. So finance is very important because they're going to help you to gather the financial needs that you need to build this project. So there is no solution which does not include local communities. So you cannot impose your solution on local communities. So you need absolutely to have buy-in for the local community, and often they know better than you probably which kind of measures are needed and how can better be used in the local context. Environmental scientists as well need to have a say, for example, in helping you to choose which trees are you going to plant, or which kind of wetlands need to be built back. Of course, governments need to they have the decisional power to facilitate the creation of nature-based solutions. We need enlightened governments, because, of course, as I told you before, there is far more money involved in business as usual projects than in nature-based solution. In the short term, imagine that, for example, protecting mangrove forest and restoring mangrove forest has the potential of saving billions of dollars worldwide in damage caused by sea level rise, storm surge, typhoon, and hurricanes that happen worldwide. Unfortunately, people don't see the averted loss as a gain. So it's more easy to say, okay, I'm going to build a seawall in front of the city because they're going to protect me from the typhoon. And you're going to spend money for it. But if you decide to protect a mangrove forest, probably people would not notice, because the economic gain they're going to get is in a form of avoided damage. Since we are talking today, I think a bit more in the urban context, here again we have some examples and the co-benefits that nature-based solution can bring. I think some of them were touched before by Tadgh in a very interesting way. Mental health, of course, is one of the main co-benefits that nature-based solution in an urban context can bring to the table. You as an engineer probably are interested in the reduction of stormwater, for example, to be treated in the public sewerage system. The concept of sponge cities, we probably have heard, is very common now in some cities in China, for example. The reduction of pollution, like I was saying, captured by the vegetation is also important. Accessibility to public garden space. There are many co-benefits that nature-based solution can bring to the table. Okay, now I'm going to give you a couple of very quick examples of what I'm actually doing in the Asian Development Bank. And the very first one is a project in Cambodia, which is called Sustainable Fisheries Project. You will see that in this project, the engineering part is just one component of the whole strategy. So what are the problems? The sea in front of Cambodia is one of the heavily, probably together with the Mediterranean, one of the most overfished sea in the world. So overfishing, of course, create ecosystem degradation, increase water pollution and eutrophication because of the nutrients that were discharged in the sea. There are a lot of climate and disaster risk in the area for the sea level rise, for the increase in occurrence of storms and hurricanes. There are also economic problems. So a very limited diversification of the fishermen. They all of them rely on the same species and wild capture fisheries that will creating, of course, a substantial decline in the fish stocks and a decline in seafood safety, because they stay out in the sea all day in small boats with no ice, and they keep, of course, fishing, and they just store the fish on the boat. But of course, if you keep dead fish in a boat for a whole day under 30 degrees Celsius, probably the fish doesn't arrive very fresh at destination. So it will create, of course, this is creating also social problems, so growing gender inequality. We know that especially when the poverty ratio is very high, the most vulnerable person are female and women and girls in all developing countries. And there is also a very high residual poverty that is very difficult to eradicate. The governance side is also lacking in, they have a very inadequate area-based marine fisheries management. They fish everything they can in all the areas without zoning them, and so without giving the sea life possibility to recover, maybe setting aside some areas to allow for the fish to reproduce and grow. So this is, we discuss with the government, so we can do many things about it. And there are three main outputs that we are trying to develop with them. Developing climate resilient coastal infrastructure is one of them. This is probably the most related to in the engineering side. Improving coastal and marine fisheries, which is more related to their true MBS in terms of protecting mangroves. I'll talk about it later. And trying to include some measure to avoid illegal fishing that is also very widespread. And on the social side, we will try to develop and promote eco-friendly and diverse marine enterprise to include different kind of economic business and economic models to not, let's say, put too much pressure on just a few resources. So what do we do to improve coastal and marine fisheries? One of the things we are thinking about is deploying digital surveillance technology to make fishery monitoring and surveillance more effective. Okay, imagine that for every, I don't know, 100 boats fishing outside, there is probably one boat patrolling, and the area is very large, and it's very difficult for governments to control all the fisheries that can happen in a different way. So using satellite monitoring, we hope that we can help them to focus on illegal fishing and probably go catch the criminals in a more efficient way. There are also a lot of skills that we are going to build on the governments, on the fishermen. We are going to try to strengthen the legal and institutional framework. For example, there is not a boat license in place. So if you are you want to fish, you buy a boat and go out and you start fishing. So there is no barrier that guarantee that when you go outside fishing, you have all the regulation in place in terms of safety, in terms of adequate measures and capacity to build. So it's just dangerous for the resources that you just can fish out everything without knowing what's going on. And also, of course, other measures like government measures like capacity building to promote climate resilience. And also there will be an important part related to food safety and market access. For example, building cold storage where people is going to bring the fish, land the fish and deposit them in this cold storage so the quality will not decrease. To develop the coastal infrastructure is another very important and complex item to discuss. I mentioned already the construction and upgrade of fish landing sites to comply with food safety regulations, so the boats will not be allowed to stay out on the sea all day without having a proper cold storage in place. If they don't have it, they are going to come back more often and drop the fish in the cold storage. Of course, they will limit the amount of time that this boat can spend in the sea. A point that I want to make it here is even if you are trying to develop a better fisheries for the country and for the local communities there, it doesn't mean that we want them to fish more. We want them to fish better. So having fish that have and seafood with a higher value to be put in the market, food which is safe, which is sustainable, and this kind of economic model could be replicated and extended for a very long time. We will try to improve also the tourism in the area, can be fishing tourism or naturalist kind of nature-based tourism, extending also the protection of coastal mangroves that are very important also as a fish nursery. And we are also exploring some strategies to protecting this mangrove system because they are very, very challenged by the sea level rise. They are adapted to live in this interface between high tide and low tide. So if the sea level rise, they will probably move back because they are not longer adapted to live permanently underwater. On the business side, the Ministry of Economy will support local communities using training, financial awareness, feasibility studies of financial feasibility studies of aquaculture, for example. Will provide grants to local communities to develop, for example, female-led businesses. Also, we will finance, of course, childcare. Childcare is very important for women because if they don't have anyone to leave the kids behind, they cannot go work. They cannot. We will always be marginalized and will never be fully part of the economic development in the area. So we will train and we will try to focus, especially on women, to provide business literacy and business management as well. Okay, let's move to the second example I'm going to give. This is based on in Fiji, in the Fiji island. Fiji is a Pacific island, Pacific country, very, very subject and exposed to the climate risk. They have very large hurricane season that every year there is at least 1 or 2 hurricanes hitting the country, creating a lot of damage. And another incredibly dangerous occurrence is the sea level rise. So imagine these people is used to live really, really a few meters from the sea, from the coast. And with the sea level rise, we are experiencing that their house goes underwater sometimes twice a day. Every time you have a peak in the tide, their house goes underwater. And this is happening more and more often because of the sea level increase. The problems, as I said, coastal flooding, ecosystem degradation, the risk linked to the climate, and of course, water pollution and freshwater salinity increase. They have maybe wells of fresh water, but when, of course, there is flooding, the quality of the fresh water decrease, so it cannot be used anymore for drinking and creating a lot of problems. So there are economic issues linked to the damage that the flooding caused to households and the damage to crops and livelihood. Of course, this increases the poverty of the area and the number of vulnerable households. The governance, unfortunately, these small states, they don't have a lot of finance, so they have lack of funding of climate adaptation, and sometimes also the regulatory framework to support coastal resilience is not updated, even if there is a lot of work going on at the moment to help them to solve this issue. So what we came out with is a seawall, but we call it hybrid nature-based solution. So, the big problem of seawalls is that sometimes are a typical example of maladaptation. Probably you are familiar with the term, but big seawalls normally include a huge quantity of cement is going to be needed to build these huge seawalls, very heavy machineries, very heavy boats. They are going to drop these huge blocks of cement. They are almost never the final solution because you maybe protect an area, but the water has to go somewhere else. So you protect a city and you flood a town which is close to it. So what we are trying to do here is addressing the problem using local available material. So we are going to use, instead of huge block of cement, locally available material like big rocks and gravel that is going to be extracted close by. But this is going to be supplemented by planting mangroves all around the area. This is, as I told you before, has a number of advantage, including advantage co-benefits for the fisheries, but also limiting coastal erosions around the structure. And also the top of the wall will be supplemented with some vegetation, which has the purpose of stabilizing the top of the seawalls. Is going to be in place in front of some of these villages. This has very low cost if compared with huge, massive infrastructure seawall. Of course, it takes time, more times. If you build a seawall, a big one, it's ready immediately before after you finish to build. In this case, you need to wait. You need to wait until the mangrove stabilize the seafloor, and sometimes can be damaged by hurricanes. So it's a longer process, and it needs a few years to be fully operational. Of course, when you decide to do this, you need to do a lot of additional studies. You can't just decide, okay, let's build a seawall in front of this village, because maybe some of these villages are not really the right location to place that. So we are using a lot of satellite images, for example. This is something we do in collaboration with the European Space Agency, which are helping us in identifying, using satellite images, also historical satellite images, how was the distribution of mangroves before and how is it now. In these photos, you can see, for example, the red areas where the mangrove were before. So these are good candidates for us as a replanting site, because you can't decide that you're going to replant mangroves where they have never been there, because maybe they weren't there because the local ecological conditions were not right for them. So even if you decide to build mangroves on top of seagrass, or where you just have sands, they are not going to grow. So to avoid to spend resources and time in some areas where you can't really do much about it, you need to do a lot of studies, and the mangrove distribution is one of them. Another interesting one we are doing is the studies on coastal evolution, still using remote sensing and historical data. Again, you can't really think of installing a seawall if a specific area on the coast is subject of evolution, of change in the shape very, very often, because otherwise your structure is going to fail probably in a very few years. So you want to build the structures in areas where the coast is more or less stable, is not moving, is not under constant erosion and deposition. So what we hope to accomplish in this project is, first of all, a proof of concept. We want to demonstrate that the concept of nature-based seawall works and is scalable. We can do it more. We can do in other countries. We can do in every country of the Pacific which is asking us to help. We want to try to restore the mangrove ecosystems that will help, of course, the retention of sediment and act as a sea life nursery, so with positive benefit on fisheries. We hope to obtain a very high reduction of coastal flooding. As I told you, some villages go underwater twice a day. So the alternative for these people is to relocate on higher ground with, you can imagine, a lot of social and economic problems associated to that, even if most likely some of them probably will not have the choice. We will try to reduce the vulnerabilities, especially of poor household or disabled person that are not able to move, and everything is making worse by the flooding. And we will try to demonstrate that we can reduce cost using locally available materials. Okay, this is almost done for me. I want just to bring you, I would like you to take home a couple of messages. So MBS have the potential to bring significant social, environmental, economic benefit, but they have to do it right. So also because we have challenges in predicting and measuring their effectiveness. So if someone is going to tell you, okay, let's go, we are going to do this MBS there, yes, it's fine, but make sure, help these people to be sure that it's really an MBS and not something masked as an SBS and is, on the contrary, business as usual. As I said before, funding for this infrastructure is still limited, so it's estimated to be less than 1% of the global climate financing. That's very, very little money, and we need to increase at least 50 times this value in the next 20 years to achieve, at least trying to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius which was established as a limit in the Paris Agreement. And so it's important, very important, to identify the real MBS against potential greenwashing attempts of the business as usual. Okay, some of these agencies and agents that will are probably threatened a bit by this development of nature-based solution. We will try to mask their own activity as nature-based, even if they are not. So investment, I can see it every day that are still biased toward the gray approach, building cement, using cement to build everything, especially in the climate adaptation sector. So there is a lot of money to be made in seawalls, in using climate proofing areas of the city or buildings and everything. There is far less money involved in nature-based solutions, in marine protected areas, in protecting forests, etc., etc. The problem is the economic analysis. When you do this analysis at the beginning of the project, it fails to identify the no-market value of nature and biodiversity. And in particular, co-benefits and ecosystem services are not accounted for. So NBS still have this aura of this still considered not bankable, so not delivering the right return of investment. To finish, I just got a couple of minutes ago before starting the presentation this diagram below, which is interesting, I think, because in terms of cost, imagine the yellow as the capital cost, which are needed to build something. On the left, you have the traditional large structural solutions, the gray solution based on cement. You see, there is a large amount of money that is going to be spent at the beginning. And you're going to have operational costs that are very low at the beginning, but then after a few years, they're going to increase because you have to maintain the structure and because they, of course, you need to update them. On nature-based solution, the expenses are far lower. Maybe you have a bit more expenses at the beginning in terms of design, in terms of finding the right material, and then you will need to maintain that time after time. Maybe you need to add additional mangroves or additional nature-based solution around the project area, but the operational costs are still increasing, but in a more linear way compared to the traditional one. So all these aspects related to finance and related to biodiversity are very important, and I invite you, when you study and you go ahead in your formation, to try to have a more holistic approach. So don't consider just the structure itself, but consider all the other components that are needed, that are very important when you're going to design some of the structure. And with this, thank you very much, and I hope that you enjoy this presentation and available for questions you need. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesco. And I'm going to, okay. Thank you for your presentation as well. And I think it's time to open the Q&A slot. I saw that there are a few comments in the chat. Okay. Tadgh shared with us the web page of GoGreenRoutes project, so thanks, and also on his university. And then Never Mujer, I don't know the right pronunciation again, say that traditional or indigenous approach use nature-based solutions to solve environmental stresses and problems. So I think he's highlighting that maybe many, let's say, traditional initiatives already used something that we named as nature-based solutions, but maybe them just named in their traditional way. So yes, I think it's a good point to highlight. Don't know if Francesco and Tadgh have some experience on this kind of, just discovering or finding very ancient and old traditions and want to share something about it.
I can very quickly say that, of course, we know that indigenous people are the custodian of our heart. The large part of biodiversity left in the world is located in indigenous territories. So I would say that most likely they know better than us, at least us intended as Western people. They know how to live with nature. They understand that we have this deep tie with nature. We cannot survive without it. So they are very good in maintaining the relationship they have with nature. So I agree. It's very important that we consider the traditional and indigenous knowledge when we plan these kind of structures and solution. Yeah.
I don't know if also Tadgh wants to add something. Okay.
Yeah. So I would say not just indigenous communities, but there are indigenous communities in most of the countries we work with, like in Norway and Sweden and in Ireland as well. But actually the cultural differences are really important to recognize. So when we look at nature connection and this relationship, and this is a measurable construct, and the difference between Ireland, UK, and, for example, Nordic and Scandinavian countries is fairly huge, because there people define themselves as part of nature, and in Ireland we create this false dichotomy that there's nature and us. That for scientific purposes we define nature as being different to us, but that's not the same as what society mirrors. So what that means is that we end up having a much more transactional relationship with nature in Ireland and UK, even though, it was Victorians and Italians actually were the two nations that led to the development of specifically urban parks. I've been to Padua, where this is a long established history in urban parks and gardens for health of the community. Now, the issue is that where you have to understand the cultural boundaries. Which means not only do you look at the historic culture, but actually we have some of our material for interview is translated into Ukrainian because of the changing demographic. So in one of our cities, Burgas in Bulgaria, the population went up by 20% because of refugees. But we land in Tallinn, and we're working in the Russian area of Tallinn, which many of them have connections to Ukraine also. So we had Ukrainian, Russian, English, and Estonian material, but we realized we didn't have any Ukrainian speakers. So even if your intention is really good as a researcher, we don't always get it right. So it's that's why I say every day is a good day.
I don't know if there are some questions from the audience here. Also, maybe some greetings from former colleagues. I don't know. Yeah, can you come here? Yeah, please.
Thank you, Tadgh, and thank you, Francesco, for those very interesting presentations. And well, my first question is maybe more for Tadgh, because you have mentioned, of course, we know all the positive effects that nature-based solutions can have. But of course, I think that one of the problems is that sometimes we don't acknowledge enough the negative effects that they can also have for the population. In the case of mental health, one of the examples that comes to my mind is potentially green gentrification, right? When we are trying to implement nature-based solutions in urban areas and we are expelling the population that used to live there. So my first question would be, what kind of advice could you give to practitioners and researchers in order to avoid these type of issues that have a very negative effect on mental health?
It's a really good question. Actually, one of the researchers on our project, who's a world leading in terms of citations and really an expert on urban health, Mark Newhausen, says actually we focus a little bit too much on the risk of gentrification. The reason he says that is because it's actually slower than we think. Now, I'm going to put in the chat that there's a tool that you use that we do a qualitative assessment of an environment. So we look at what types of nature, does it have formal gardens, or does it have just areas which aren't managed and are pollinator areas, for example. And one of the things we learned from that assessment is if you don't have like rose gardens, which by the way are not so sustainable in any way, but maybe history, maybe part of a culture, right? If you don't have formal flower areas and you have a more contemporary natural space, what you do is you have this concept of just good enough nature. Right. So what we call informal green space, the bits between, the fence and the road, near the railway tracks, actually valuing these different elements of nature is really, really important, because from a psychological perspective, we pick up in these cues. They also have, many of the properties which are required from climate mitigation as well. And I think that's where, having a modest design. So actually it comes to a funding question. Don't overfund urban nature, because if you give too much, what they'll do is it'll lead to gentrification. You give enough and guidance on the just good enough principle of nature, well, then you actually you ensure that, yeah, for sure it's green, but they haven't suddenly transformed brownfield into an arboretum or a park, of a traditional park like Versailles or something, like a grand park. So this degree of advancement is important to monitor. I guess when you get the views of the community and you talk about maintenance, you have another issue. Whereas if it requires low maintenance, the community will give good buy-in, as will the municipality. If it's high maintenance, like a rose garden or something much more formal, there's going to be, from the beginning, questions about who will manage this.
Okay. And can I make another question? Yeah. Because, well, I know we have been seeing all this wave of incorporating the private sector to this implementation of nature-based solutions. And of course, I think their contribution is fundamental. But since we're talking about greenwashing, my question would be, which are the kind of advices that we can give them in order to avoid this kind of issue? For example, we have seen some tools and some guidelines, but more specific, is there a way in which maybe we can avoid them producing or reproducing this type of issue, or just maybe avoid working with them, which I don't think it's a possibility, to be honest.
Thank you. This is also an interesting question. The private sector is extremely important in developing these solutions. We can't really think about moving forward. Also, from a financial perspective, the government they don't have enough resources to implement these solutions. But you're right. So in some cases, of course, the profits come first, and the bottom line is what drives some. I would say not all of them, but some of the agents in the market. A typical example is the carbon credit market. Probably you are aware of this. Carbon credits are this. Let's say a private company can buy carbon credit to offset their own emissions, and to create carbon credits, one of the main methods that are being developed by the market is protecting some areas from deforestation. That is complicated because most of the time it happens just on paper. So a private company, which is kind of a broker of carbon credit, comes in and say, okay, we are going to protect this area. We're going to divide the area in 10 carbon credits, and we're going to sell them. The communities get 50%, I get 50%. That's in theory is how the market works. The problem is the market has distortions, and sometimes you have bad actors on the market, some kind of cowboys. Sometimes the communities are not even informed about it. So I think what we really need is a proper monitoring, proper agencies that go on the ground and check that what has been promised, in this case on carbon credit, but can be NBS, can be whatever it is, and can maybe some kind of certification that really give the tag of, okay, this is a proper NBS, a proper carbon credit market, etc. Of course, it's complicated because, you know, certifications has also their own downfalls, but, you know, there is something on the monitoring and evaluation that really need to put some effort on.
Okay.
I hope I answer your question.
Yes, thank you very much to both of you again.
Okay, I saw. Okay, so Nicola just left, but yes, we are going to share everything with the attendants in the DOL platform, but also, I mean, if you have particular needs, please again directly write to me or to Nicola D'Alberton to get the presentation of the speakers. I don't know if there are other comments or questions from the audience.
I could just make a quick point, and it has to do with financing.
Yes.
So one of our cities is Lati, and honestly, when you look at climate change risks and Lati, it's not too bad, right? Turns out their growing season extends, biodiversity moves northwards, they get warmer temperatures. It's not so catastrophic, and this is actually one of the challenges. As we know, climate change is asymmetric in its impact across Europe and globally. So what they've done in Lati is something really interesting, which we don't do in Ireland, right? So the Finnish ambassador works with us and supports our project, and she said, what's the difference between Finland and Ireland? Okay, said in Ireland, when we build green infrastructure, often NBS and greenways, these interconnected active travel and soft tourism routes, we do it based on a financial economic model, which is based on bed nights. How many extra nights will people from overseas stay in their country, right? So it's actually a soft tourism model. In Lati, they run a different model. They have built essentially a green route, a short green route, maybe 600 meters long, with natural materials to a health forest from a hospital designed for patients, healthcare workers, visitors, and the community. Now, their economic model is totally different to the one being used in many other countries, because they realize the value for health. What they don't realize, and I will predict it now, that this will become a tourist attraction. So I'm not saying this is a good thing, but at least you can manage it in terms of number of buses and tourism and parking spaces and technology to maybe even create a virtual experience so not everyone has to go there. But the models are often different. And actually, that's good, because we need different people to fund NBS. Sometimes we need, you know, that a government agency responsible for forestry and perhaps tourism or other areas might come together, even with a commercial side. And in another case, we know that actually the health authorities, it's the regional health authority will be contributing towards this, as well as our EU project.
Thanks for highlighting this. The very last question. Okay, Massimo, if you want to come closer.
Both of you, Massimo teaching here in the Master of Science of Engineering for Environment and Territory. And my question is focusing on the job experiences, how we can mainstream nature-based solutions in job places, workplaces, in offices, in factories, in not only in outdoor activities, because we are usually speaking about nature-based solution apply in cities in free time, but in daily experience, what about to mainstream this nature-based solutions in the places in we spend 8 hours, 10 hours, depending on, or more, in my case, 12 hours, unfortunately. And so, especially in factory, I see that the business sector, but also public administration, are not experimenting many solutions based on nature. And so what about this topic? Thank you.
I can comment briefly. We wrote a proposal for the European Commission a number of years ago on mental health in the workplace. And it was the best title we ever came up with for a project. Unfortunately, it wasn't funded. It was called Nature Works. Nature Works. And what the idea was, if you add nature-based solutions and what we technically called nature-based interventions, so they're not always the same thing, you have the capacity to connect people with spaces which promote well-being and productivity at work and promote other positive habits like active travel. And at the same time, they meet many different SDG targets. For example, something we call green exercise, just being active outdoor in green space, hits about somewhere between 9 and 11, depending on the activity of the UN SDGs. And that's just looking at that kind of macro level. But I think this is important, and there is a wealth of research emerging in this area. When we did our review, which I'll put in chat, we didn't find such strong evidence. It's probably changed a little bit today, but this is probably what we need, is not the discrete approach or just a large scale approach. We need a universal approach. So nature-based solutions and interventions, something slightly different, are the default. So if we flip this to being the default, well, then we're in a much better place, because then it becomes sustainable for people to, sorry to use that word, it becomes feasible for people to have better metrics because it's your default, right? So I think this is one of the issues we currently suffer from, because if we end up working at all different scales across different ecosystems, it's hard to come up with common standards and metrics. One of the roles we have in our projects is to try to develop some metrics which are more positively orientated about the perception of the environment. But I think that's a really good question, is how do we build this into our lives? For example, in our proposal, we had planned to work with healthcare workers and people who work in air traffic control and airport security, all of whom can't regularly access nature the way we might view it.
Thanks. I don't know if Francesco wants to add something. No?
Sorry, I was able to unmute myself. Very quickly, because I don't have direct experience in that, but the first thing that comes to my mind is in my office, we have a huge air conditioning system going 24 hours a day, linked with the air purifier system, because the traffic and air quality in Manila is terrible. And maybe some of this, this energy use can be at least partially solved by using some of this nature-based solution in the workplace. We know that plants have this amazing capacity of regulating microclimate and absorbing pollutants. But I'm not aware that anyone at the moment is doing anything related to this. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, I think we finished for the questions and also for the speeches. Thanks again to Francesco and Tadgh to join us and to share their experiences. And thanks also to the attendants online and in person for having joined us. And again, if you have any doubts, questions about the final report, please write me. Okay, have a good night and thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Buonasera, grazie mille.
Grazie.